Hey folks, welcome to Running Retro. Today we're going to do a Dreamcast Piggyback BIOS mod. So we're going to start by taking the surface mount BIOS chip and straightening the pins on it. Now as you can see, this is the BIOS chip. It is surface mount, so you need to get all of these legs straight out from the chip. And the way I've found to do that is just a pair of pliers with as a flat surface as possible, and grab the whole pin from the chip out so you're making as much surface contact as possible, and just straighten each leg individually. You can straighten the whole side a little bit by putting it on a flat surface and bending it, but you're still going to have to straighten that kink out. And this way you're grabbing the whole leg, you're putting equal pressure, and you're not putting extra tension on anything, so it's much less likely to break. I did start, when I first started doing this, I tried to use a couple methods to expedite it, make it a little bit faster, and I did have one leg break, but I had it break in the middle of the mod, so it was a real inconvenience. The best way to do it is just patiently, slowly, take your time, and straighten them out as uniformly as possible. You also want to make sure that they are coming straight out and that they are parallel to each other. So if you are looking at it and you've got some that are getting closer to each other, then just take your fingernail and move that very gently back so that all of them are out and all of them are parallel. And this will make your life easy if you do it right, and hard if you don't do it right, because if you do it right, then it's going to line up nice and neatly to the pins below it. And if you don't take your time with it and you don't do it right, then you're not going to have your legs line up cleanly. You're going to have trouble soldering it on top, and it's really quite a pain in the butt. I'm getting towards the last one here. It's a little tedious, but it's not too bad. And the metal's pretty easy to work with, so you don't need to apply too much pressure here. And then I take it on a solid flat surface and bend them 90 degrees to the chip. And that way, as you can see right here, we get a nice, tight, uniform line. Go back and double check, make sure that they're all parallel to each other and they're not leaning towards each other. Just these little couple steps right here at the beginning will make your life a lot easier. Now we are going to have to bend some of these pins out, which is what I'm doing now. And we will have to bend leg 12 up, and we will have to bend another couple. We'll get to that in a second. So 12 is the real pain, because in a moment we'll also have to lift pin 12 of the original BIOS chip, and that can be a little bit difficult. But ultimately we will be lifting legs 1, 12, and 44. This is all assuming that you're doing this on a VA01 motherboard. Now 44 is obviously easy because it's the last one, and 1 is easy because it's the first one, so you get kind of a nice cheat sheet on that. Don't mind that little cap there, that's just the cap to the tweezers that I have. And here's the Dreamcast. Here's our patient. This is my personal Dreamcast. I like to tinker on these things. For the first time I'm doing the mods, I like to do them on my own hardware, and that way something goes wrong, it's mine, it's not yours. Make sure that it works properly, make sure that it works as intended. There's 4 screws here, one in each corner, and then make sure you take out the modem here. It can be a little rough, but there's one screw hiding underneath there. At least it's not like the PS2 where you have to take off the rubber pads on the feet to get to it, which is kind of nice. And I really should just have flipped it up here and taken care of it like that, trying not to hit the camera. So, yep, and just pop it right off. And there she is. Power supply on the right, GD-ROM in the middle. It's a nice, elegant little system. A little bulky, a little clunky, but still very viable. Now, I am working on figuring out how to have the GD-ROM as well as the a hard drive in here, an SSD. So this mod only covers the Piggyback BIOS functioning, but it doesn't cover, or the actually modding the chip and being able to switch between the BIOS. As far as getting the video, the custom BIOS installed, and some of those things, that's going to be for a later time. So you do need to disconnect the GD-ROM, and then you'll need to take off the fan, the controller port, and the power supply there. Not very difficult, just a couple screws. There's 2 screws for the power switch there. 2 screws for the PSU. It just pulls up. A little stubborn sometimes, but it just pulls up. Now in mine, somebody had been in there earlier, and there was a screw missing on the PSU, so somebody had tinkered with my Dreamcast before I acquired it. This is one I've had for a long time. I just got it at a game store probably 10-15 years ago. It's been a while. Taking the fan out next. And the controller port. Sorry, those screws at the top aren't completely visible. There's just 2 for the fan and there's 2 for the power switch. Make sure when you're putting this together and when you're taking this apart, you're paying attention to where the long screws and the short screws are going. Because if you put the wrong screw in the wrong hole, you have a chance of destroying your motherboard. Now the GD-ROM just pops out there. You can see the connector just lifts straight out. Be careful with it. You don't want to smudge the laser or do any damage to it. Since that's getting to be the most desirable part of the Dreamcast. Now we're just going to take this top plate off. And underneath there is the motherboard. So we're almost there. So when you open it up, it looks like it's a lot of bulk, and it is, but most of it is just there on the top. Most of it's just the bulk of the individual units. It's pretty easy to clear out. Pretty easy to see what you're doing. So, as you're taking this apart, you can use this as a reference. This video is much more about the actual mod on the motherboard. If you would like to see a video of just pure disassembly and a lot of detail on that, then let me know and I'm happy to do one. There's the motherboard. Again, this is a VA01 motherboard, so you need to make sure that you know which one you're dealing with. If you look at the very top middle of the screen, it's upside down, but it says VA1. So there's VA0, VA1, VA2. My quad hands here are great. And there we have our BIOS chip. So you're going to take the new chip and line it up on top of the old chip and make sure that your pins are all in line, that they look good. Take your time with it. Make sure that it's good. If it's not, lift it up. Make sure it's square. Just take your time with it. Now, we will have to remove, or rather lift, pin 12 of the original BIOS chip off the board. That's really important, and it's probably the single hardest part of this mod. This mod is not very difficult, but it can be somewhat tedious. And the idea is that by putting the BIOS chip on top, you can choose whether you're booting from a custom BIOS or whether you're booting from the original BIOS. So when I'm doing my mods, I like to make sure that all the original functionality of the system is still intact, as well as the modded functionality of the system. Sometimes that's just not possible, and honestly with this I'm trying to figure out a way to actually fit an SSD in the case alongside a GD-ROM, but as it stands, you can do this with a couple other methods, but they're a little bit slower. They go through the serial port, and I could just take it and use a card for it instead. But I really like the idea of a hard drive, and I think it's kind of cooler that way. If you can get the cables working, then you can hot swap hard drives, which is pretty cool. So you can just have different hard drives for different things that you want. You'd still have to take the top of the case off, but it's not that bad. I'll put a little flux here just to get the pins ready to go, and we'll start lifting that pin. Gotta love the boards on these things. They're always fun to look at. Now I do put flux on here right now. You don't have to. It's a little premature, but I don't know. I find that I get a little bit better heat distribution. It's it could just be all in the head, but for me, I always feel a little bit better when I use just a little bit of flux. So you don't want to flood the thing either. You just need a small little drop, but it definitely helps to have just a little bit. And you can see the notch on the right hand side there on the paint on the motherboard and the white lines showing you which side is going to the left, and there's the dot in the upper right hand corner of the chip from this angle, so you can help sort of keep yourself oriented by watching those two things. It helps. It can get a little bit interesting. Sorry about the quality on the light there. I've got a pretty good camera, but it likes to autofocus and get a little blurry sometimes and be a little squirrely, but it's not too bad. And I am tinning all of these legs right now, so that way there's just a little extra solder on them, and they're going to be a little bit easier to actually solder this chip to. I also tin the legs of the chip, so that's what I was doing there off camera for a minute when there wasn't much going on camera. Just tinning the legs on the chip. Just run it down here, get a little bit on there. Make sure you're not bridging. It's easier to just sort of run it down like that and then smooth it out. set that chip back on top, make sure everything is still aligned, make sure that you're good to go. Now this is all done in real time, so as you're watching this, this is how long it's taking me to do it, and I've done a little bit of editing, but not much. The reason being that, you know, this was my 5th one done, but I actually got a bunch of chips, and as it turns out, the chips were all bad. So this was I found a way to test these chips, and this was my first run where I knew that the chips were good. So that was really unfortunate, and this mod is difficult to undo. So if it's not done right, then it's kind of a problem. Or if you have to undo it, then it can be a little tedious. It can be done, but it is really tedious to do that. Now you'll see I wiggle the chip just a little bit, and that's just to see whether I've actually gotten adhesion. I'm not expecting all of these solder joints to hold at the beginning. I'm just trying to get everything in place so that I'm not moving the chip around and it's reasonably stationary at this point. So when you're doing this, it can look like these pins are soldered together, and they're actually not. So make sure that they're actually soldered together. It can also be really easy to bridge them. So you'll see when I'm done with this, I take a multimeter and I test each pin individually. And that's the best way to do it. Sweeping up like this, getting a little extra solder on the bottom ones, and then just sweeping it back and forth, and it's still not taking. It takes a solid chunk of solder to do this. You don't want to fill up the entire knife edge, but you do want to use a fair amount of solder. If it's one of those things where you're scared of bridging it and you don't know how to get the solder off of the pins, this A, might not be the mod for you. And B, if that's the case, then you should just go easy on the solder and then just slowly work it until you actually get the amount that you need. If you're comfortable manipulating the solder on the pins, then you can use a little bit more solder to begin with, and you'll save yourself some time. I'm taking the slower and more methodical approach here because if you're watching this to try and figure out how to do it, then at least this is sort of the more tentative way to do it, and it's a little bit less scary. Now I did lift the pin on the top chip, and I have not lifted the pin on the bottom chip yet. You can do it either way, and I have done it either way. I do like this method because you don't have to mess around with skipping the two pins that are straight out. If you break the original BIOS chip, then you're in a real tough spot, because you either need to know how to fix it, and they are not easy to fix. If you've ever had to fix a surface mount chip, they're not easy to fix at all. I've done a couple where I've drilled into the chip and then soldered a lead onto a broken pin, and it is not fun. It's incredibly frustrating. It's really slow work, and it's really easy to break again from there. So this way you're not taking any chances of tweaking the pins, and that's a plus. But because it's still on the board and you've got this chip on top, it's a lot harder to lift. Now you also have a sort of a perk in that because the pin is down there and you're running solder over it, you've effectively already tinned it for when we're going to solder a wire to it in a little bit. Now here you can see that I am going through with my multimeter and I'm testing to make sure that there's continuity between the top and the bottom of each pin, and I'm also testing to see if there are any bridges, and then I go through and I'll add a little bit more solder, and I'll either add more to the pins that are not bridged but not soldered together, or I'll remove solder and start cleaning it up. And a lot of times you can clean up a little bit and then use that solder to actually fix your problem. You can see a little extra solder on my soldering iron there, so not the worst, but definitely some excess solder there. Going to clean up these last few. There weren't enough solder on these, so I had to add a little bit. And there we go, just running it down, those right on the joint. And if your pins aren't vertical and lined up, they're indented a little bit, they're bent a little bit too far, and that top chip doesn't line up with the bottom chip, this is a real pain. It's really frustrating. So this is where it's worth your time to sit down and really make sure that everything is right in line and everything is good. Going through, testing all of these again, making sure that they are in fact making contact. Don't worry too much too. If you are having trouble with a pin, keep at it. You'll get it eventually. You just need to make sure that you actually do connect all of them. That's the biggest concern here. As you see, I needed a little bit more solder, and all of it is on that upper left-hand side. All my other connections pretty good. Just that upper left-hand side. There are a couple pins there at the end that just aren't making a connection. So I'm just staying the course, testing them and making sure that they're good and that I've got no bridges. I tend to be a little overcautious. I know I just tested a couple of those, and they were fine, but as long as I'm going through the line, I test them again. It doesn't hurt to double check, and going through it multiple times means that I'm less likely to miss something or make an error. Little bit of a bridge on those last two pins, just taking care of that now. Of course, you want to test it again after you do this, because I've done this a couple times and it is just in getting rid of a little extra solder, it has pulled off the solder and broken the connection between the pins that were connected earlier. So just make sure each time you do it that you're going back and making sure that there's actually a good connection. Just like I'm doing here. And then I'm tinning that top pin. And that takes care of the first side. The second side, tinning that other pin, pin 44. So now I've tinned pin 44 and I've tinned pin 12. In this, I forgot to lift pin 1. I will get to that, but don't be confused. You do need to lift pin 1. And here you'll be able to see a little bit better. Just going through here, carefully, slowly, gently, treating the poor thing as kindly as I can. Got a little bit of a bridge there, but that's fine. Don't worry about it. Just make sure it's not there when you're done. One of my pins towards the lower left is not lined up that well, so I think it's the second pin in there. So I have a little bit of trouble here. So remember. Going through, testing all these. Obviously make sure that when you're going through and doing this, that you are not touching the leads of your multimeter together, or that you're touching multiple pins and reading continuity off of the wrong pins. And some of these pins are in fact bridged. So for instance, legs 32 and 33 are already bridged. So if you get continuity on 32, you're going to get continuity on 33. So you need to be a little careful about that. Just make sure that you're not, that you are actually reading the pins that you're trying to read. Just need a little more solder down there, working it down. Yep. Well, yep, there we go. Trying to keep my soldering tip as clean as possible, and that way it's going to get less oxidation and fewer problems. Now, just from this angle, you can see a bridge there. When I was doing this, because it was on the far side of me, and I was trying to keep that to the camera, it was a lot harder for me to see. But who needs eyes when they've got a tester, right? Now, getting these to, not the tips on your tester and not touch it can be a little bit tedious on these. Just a little bit of cleanup here. Just a little bit of cleanup. Take care of that bridge. There we go. There's that bridge taken care of. Now I did have a thing where the leads on my tester had broken here, and they still worked, but they were not the most reliable, and I needed to shoot this video because the time was right, but I couldn't wait for the delivery of the new tips, so I did have to take a little extra time here, be very careful, and make sure that they were actually making contact. So that's why you'll see me go back a few extra times here just to double check. And it looks like I'm touching more than I actually am there. If you're looking over top of it there, I wasn't touching too much. And there we have it. Nice, solid connection. No bridges. Nope. Ready to go. Yep. Looking kind of pretty. I mean, this mod is really cool. It's also kind of fun to do. there's one little bit of solder there. There we go. There. Now I see it. It's easier to see from the top than it is from the bottom here, but did find it, did correct it, did get it. So this mod was one of my first, and it was on my own personal. So when you're watching this, one of the reasons that I filmed this one was because I thought it would be helpful for someone to see sort of it wasn't a first attempt, but very early on in the attempts to do this, and that way they actually do get a real idea for how long you're going to be in for and what you're actually going to have to do. Once you do it, it's really not that bad. You just straighten out the pins on the chip, flatten the chip, bend the pins, get them lined up and 90 degrees to the chip, and then slap it on, solder it down, and wire everything else, and you're good to go. And you've got the experience of previous times for how difficult it can be to get these connections to bridge. But when you're doing it for the first time, and you're a little bit tentative, and even the first couple times you're still kind of tentative, this is how you make sure that something isn't wrong. Keep going through, keep checking it, keep redoing your connections, and make sure that you've got it. And the cool thing about this mod too is if you've got a soldering iron, then the chips are cheap. Even now, because of supply issues, it may take you a second to get them, but in general, you can get them pretty well. Now, I did have a problem here when I had to clean up that one last bridge. A lot of these let loose, so I actually did end up just making the decision to go back in with a healthy chunk of solder and start working this down and distributing it all to the other chips, to the other pins, thoroughly coating the chips. Obviously the situation I've got now is not the situation you want, but just pulling it up on my iron and distributing it down the others and being patient with it, you can get it all cleaned out. It's a little stubborn. Yep, pulling that. This is my first chip work too, these mods. So I was still getting used to soldering these onto a board, let alone to each other. So this was kind of a good opportunity to tinker and experiment for moving solder around on chip pins, which can be a little frustrating sometimes. And it's not difficult if you're patient. It's just, it can be a little bit frustrating from time to time. Just keep working it. Keep working it. Yeah, see, each time I'm doing this, some of it's coming off on the soldering iron tip. Some of it's coming off on the tip. Some of it is bridging, and some of it is moving down the pins as I'm sweeping. The biggest problem here, the thing that I found the most frustrating, a little bit more flux to help this flow. One of the things I found the most frustrating is when you're going down and you're cleaning this up a little bit, that it will break the connections of pins that you've already soldered. So you do need to take care of that. Obviously, I still have one big glob there, and I'll come back and take care of that in a second. I'm just making sure that I haven't broken the connection on any of those, and I don't really want to keep. Yeah, there we go. I don't want to keep going down the ones that are really solidly connected, because I don't want that connection to, I don't want to sever that connection since I've, finally gotten it. Yeah. Yep. Going down, giving it one more test, making sure I don't have any bridges here. That one was a little bit hard to read. It didn't want to give me continuity, but that was my tester. That wasn't the joint. That last joint gave me a lot of trouble on this run. And I've found that each time I do it, there's usually one pin. There's usually one pin that just wants to be kind of grouchy and kind of grumpy. But just keep working at it. Keep working at it. Be patient. And you'll get it. I do use a lot of flux here, but I just wanted to make sure that nothing was getting oxidized. Using high quality, no clean flux, and yeah, there's a couple little blobs on those pins, and I just wanted to make sure that they were clean. Now, if I were doing this again, and when I have the way I'll actually do that is I shouldn't have moved the soldering iron back and forth like that. That was really the moment to move it vertically up and down and just, keep the solder on the pins that it's already on. By moving it left to right like that, I increased the likelihood of bridging it. And since I'd gone to all the trouble of correcting my bridges and taking care of that, that was a little bit of that was just, not the best idea. Not a problem, but as long as you're making sure that you didn't bridge. But, I was more likely to have something mess up than not. And that was my problem. Down here, this last pin just would not bridge, no matter what I did. It gave me no end of trouble. And it's really kind of difficult to get the solder in there. I think this gets it. Hard to not get enough solder when you apply the solder directly to the pin. And yet, and also easy to bridge a couple pins when you're doing it like this. So just trying to be as gentle and delicate as I can. This is not the preferred way that I like to do this. I much prefer to put it on my soldering tip and run it down. I don't like applying the solder directly like this. It's just the likelihood of you bridging something goes up so far, especially when you're using solder, the solder spool like I had there. That's that thick. So just being diligent here, making sure. Oh. Yep. Trying to clean it up a little bit. And at this point, I'm kind of tentative because every time I've touched it, you get pin 43 there connected and pin 42, but then your solder iron touches pin 41 and pin 41 separates. And then you go back to get pin 41 connected again, and pin 42 separates, and that's what's happening here. I'm going back and forth because as I'm connecting one pin, another pin is releasing, and another leg is releasing, and so it's just playing like hopscotch with these legs. Needing a little bit more solder there. There we go. And I mean, as you can see, these look like they're all connected, but they aren't. Now there is a small via here that you need to go through. I'm using 30 gauge Kynar wire, and I've found it to be the best wire for it. This wire is really hard to see on the other side of the motherboard. It's really hard to see, so be aware of that when you're doing this. The best way I've found is to take your finger and just run it very gently over that area, and you'll find where the wire is sticking up. And this was really difficult to get on camera, but it's sort of off in no man's land there amongst those surface mount resistors. And I'm bad about this when I flip it over, losing track of where it is, but just be patient with that. It doesn't take much since it's in a via. Just need to tap it. And that is the wire that's going to connect over to pin 44. I give it a little tug, make sure that it's actually in there. And on this side, I snip off the wire as flush to the board as I can, so that there's no chance of it reaching down and touching the bottom shield. I'm sorry for the focus here. It can be a little hard to see, but it's just a small little 30 gauge wire straight through the via. If you're looking for a really good place to read how to do this mod, then I definitely recommend Monkey. And just search Piggyback Dreamcast BIOS mod. And this is the VA1 board. He covers all of the different revisions. And that's actually who I went to learn how to do this. So you can definitely go and check him out. But hopefully this will make a good video tutorial sort of side by side to go along with it. Yeah, for once normally I get a nice flow of solder down that. This was the one where the solder was being a little bit stubborn about transferring to the via. And because it's so small and so delicate, I'd like to try and make sure that it's really connected there. Be careful though, there are a couple other surface mount items there that you can touch and release, and you don't want to desolder something from the board that needs to be there, so make sure that you're not dropping the soldering iron too far. And we'll finish this mod up in chapter 2 next week. Thanks guys.